Welcome to our first video lecture in our learning unit. This is a continuation of Unit 3, and the focus today is modules 3.7a and b, which is all about classical conditioning. So a little bit of background. You may have heard of a man named Ivan Pavlov, or you might have heard Pavlov's dogs before, but Ivan Pavlov is the person responsible for discovering classical conditioning. And he discovered this by accident. He was studying how salivation aided in the digestion process of dogs. And he obviously needed to give the dogs food in order to see how the amount of saliva that they make impacts the digestion in their stomach. And so what he was finding is that these dogs would begin to fill their cheek tubes prior to him giving them food, being ready essentially to measure and take notice of how it impacts the digestion. And so he kind of changed gears to look at what he coined classical conditioning, or we also can call it associative learning, where what he discovered is that the dogs had made an association between his presence, walking in the door, and getting food. And so now what was happening is these dogs, at the mere sight of his presence, were beginning to fill their cheek tubes without him wanting that to happen. And so he turned his work into classical conditioning, where he was learning about associations. How can animals make associations between two stimuli? A stimuli that's previously neutral, i.e. him walking into the room, and a stimuli that naturally inborn causes a response in that animal. So in this case, it was the food. So I think about classical associative learning, association between two stimuli. So basic premise, food naturally causes salivation. That's not something new that we didn't know about dogs. We know when you ring a bell for a dog, nothing happens. There is nothing innately responsive for a dog when a bell rings. However, if you pair a bell and food, that dog will salivate. At this point, when we pair those things together, the dog is salivating over the food. When Pavlov started his experiment, the dog was originally salivating over that food. What he did is right prior to the introduction of that food, he produced, or he shared what we call that neutral stimulus, or that bell. So eventually, after enough associations between the bell and the food, we find that the bell causes that salivation without having to have that food present. That's the idea of classical conditioning. That dog has made an association between the bell and the food. And so now that bell causes a response similar to what the food alone used to cause. So another pictorial representation using the vocabulary. The food is the unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned means it's untrained. It's a natural stimuli that produces a response without having to train. UCR is the salivation to the food. This is the unconditioned response. You don't have to teach a dog to salivate to the food, hence why it's unconditioned. The bell at this point is a neutral stimulus, a stimulus that doesn't cause any response for the dog. When we pair those things together, the bell, or what's called the conditioned stimulus now, condition meaning trained, stimuli, thing, pair that before the food, that unconditioned stimulus, we get an unconditioned response. The more we pair the bell and the food, eventually that bell alone, that conditioned stimulus, what was once neutral, causes salivation without the presence of food being there. So that association has been made between the bell and the food. So now that bell causes a similar response. Now, you'll probably notice up here that salivation is on here twice. Salivation is both the unconditioned response and the conditioned response. So when we ask ourselves, what's the difference then between the unconditioned and the conditioned response? It is what it's responding to. So the unconditioned response is in response to the unconditioned stimulus, while the conditioned response is in response to the conditioned stimuli. Or in this case, salivating to the bell is the unconditioned response, while salivating to the food is the unconditioned response, while salivating to the bell is the conditioned response. We also know about something called higher order conditioning. So once we've established that association between a UCS and a CS, that first initial classical conditioning, we have discovered that there are animals and humans, which we'll talk about the human interaction later, are able to do what's called higher order conditioning, where they can take the conditioning that has occurred and they can make now a new condition to another neutral stimuli. So, for example, we know in Pavlov's dog, he paired the bell with the food until that conditioned stimulus, the bell, caused a conditioned response, i.e. the salivation. Well, once that conditioned stimulus is present, once that one is already instilled in that dog, you can now almost treat that conditioned stimuli like an unconditioned stimulus and pair it with another new neutral stimuli. In this case, you might pair it with the look of the researcher in a white lab coat. The dog begins to now associate that researcher in a white lab coat is going to ring the bell, which means I get food, which means I'm going to salivate. So they first made the connection between the bell and the food so that the bell caused salivation. Now they're making an association between the bell and that researcher. So now that researcher causes that conditioned response just like the bell did. So that's higher order conditioning or second order conditioning, where you have created an association and then now you're creating another level of association that animal has made. So extending these principles, what else explains what's at work when you are classically conditioning somebody? So the first extension is called acquisition. And acquisition means to acquire an association between two things. So acquisition is the point when that neutral stimulus or that now conditioned stimulus causes a conditioned response without the UCS present. So it's the moment that dog salivates to the bell alone without having to have the food present. That's when acquisition has happened. That's when we have acquired classical conditioning. Now, we don't know how long acquisition takes, and we're going to talk about some things that impact acquisition here in a second. But for the best and quickest acquisition, the goal is to pair that CS followed by the UCS about a half a second apart. The closer you can pair the CS and UCS, the quicker acquisition is going to occur. And so ideally, a half a second between that presentation of the CS and the presentation of the UCS will lead to the fastest acquisition. Now, that's not always the case, but in general, that is the case. When it's not the case is things that we are biologically prepared to make associations with. In this case, there are certain things that we make an association with, regardless of how long in between the CS and UCS presentation is, regardless of if it's only presented one time, there's only a one trial conditioning. And this is for things like taste aversion. So take, for example, in this picture, this woman is obviously very pregnant. She perhaps, let's say, got sick. She now is next to her husband with popcorn, and she has made an association between the smell of popcorn causing nausea. Even though that popcorn didn't make her nauseous, she has paired the popcorn smell with her getting sick from just being pregnant. And so now just that popcorn smell, that CS, is now causing her to feel nauseous. So looking at vocabulary, right? The CS is the popcorn because it doesn't naturally cause you to be sick. The UCS would be some sort of whatever caused you to be sick from being pregnant. So pregnancy sickness, we'll just call it as the UCS. Pregnancy sickness naturally causes you to get sick and vomit. Well, let's say she's sitting next to him, smells the popcorn, The pregnancy sickness kicks in. She vomits because of that. Well, just after one time of that occurring, if she now feels nauseous or vomits at the smell of popcorn, she has developed classical conditioning very quickly. She has done it in one trial. And so John Garcia discovered that taste biologically prepares us. If we can make the association, even if it's 20 minutes apart, even if the smell of popcorn happens 20 minutes before she gets sick, before the pregnancy hormone causes her sickness, even if it takes a long time, we still will make that association in one trial. And that's because taste aversion helps us think evolutionary wise, right? Those ancestors who got sick from eating poisonous food would hopefully make that association so that they never make that mistake again. It helps to prepare and allow us to survive. And so there are some things that only take one trial to make that association. And there are some things that could be spaced more than that half second apart and still make association with quickly. Some more vocabulary is something called extinction. Extinction means it's gone. It's no longer there. Extinction occurs when you ring that bell for the dog who's been classically conditioned, a dog who already has been through acquisition, who is already salivated to that bell. Extinction occurs when you ring that bell and no longer does that dog have that association and that dog no longer salivates. Spontaneous recovery is something that sometimes, you should have in your notes the word sometimes. After extinction, all of a sudden, that dog salivates to that bell again. So as you see in this picture, that dog, extinction, to hell with your bell, who cares? I'm not going to respond anymore. And then all of a sudden, that bell, he made that association again, and now that bell is causing him to feel that same way that he used to. So spontaneous recovery is when all of a sudden acquisition comes back for a quick moment after extinction has occurred. So this beautiful graphic helps to kind of see the life cycle of classical conditioning. So as we are going up this mountain, this is when we are trying to classically condition an animal or a human. This is when we're presenting the CS, or that neutral stimulus, followed quickly by that UCS, ideally a half a second for quickest acquisition. And we are getting a UCR. CS, UCS, UCR, CS, UCS, UCR. Who knows how many times? It may only take one trial. It may take 50 trials until you get to the top where all of a sudden acquisition has occurred and we present a CS and we now get a CR. As we go down the mountain, this is where we keep presenting that CS, getting a CR. Bell, salivate, bell, salivate, bell, salivate. Who knows how many times we present the bell without food that the dog will salivate until eventually I present that bell to the dog and he no longer salivates. This is the point of extinction. You've extinguished that classical conditioning association. Then, sometimes after extinction, we get this little peak again where I present that bell again, that CS, and that dog has another CR. That may happen once, twice, a few times, and then eventually that dog or animal or human will go back to extinction. Last two is generalization, which is we want to focus in on that CS. So that conditioned stimulus that was once previous a neutral stimulus. If that child or if that animal has a conditioned response to things similar to the conditioned stimulus trained with, generalization has occurred. So think about Pavlov's dog. If that dog responds to not only a dinner bell, but a doorbell, I don't know what's another bell, school bell, bell that goes off at a fire station, right? If that dog starts to salivate to all different types of bells, generalization has occurred. In contrast, discrimination happens when that child or animal only responds to the specific conditioned stimulus trained with. So if he was trained, the dog was trained with a dinner bell, and he only salivates to a dinner bell. He doesn't salivate to a school bell. He doesn't salivate to a doorbell. He doesn't salivate to any other bells. Discrimination has occurred. He is only responding to the CS that he was trained with. That is all I have for you today. We will be practicing in class tomorrow.